The downfall of a billionaire's empire began the very moment a maid's 12-year-old daughter dared to speak inside the highest apartment in Chicago. Charles Whitmore, the man who liked to call himself the king of the skyline, grinned as his Japanese guest prepared to sign a contract worth billions. The glass penthouse above the city wasn't just a place to live, it was his throne. Walls of crystal windows stretched toward the clouds, Italian carpets smoothed the floors like still water, and leather sofas shone under the lights. Expensive paintings hung from the walls like quiet reminders of wealth. No one noticed the small girl standing in the corner, holding an old backpack close to her chest. Her name was Naomi Carter. She was 12 years old, black, and nearly invisible in that polished world of power. But inside that worn bag lay a page and a memory that would soon crack the room wide open. That morning should have been her mother's rest day. Deborah Carter worked long hours for a cleaning service, always saying yes to the hardest shifts, still fighting the debts left after her husband's passing. Then the phone rang, an urgent request from Whitmore's house manager. A last-minute meeting with a Japanese investor, a $2 billion deal on the table, and a need for extra hands. There's a bonus, they promised. That one word, bonus, was enough for Deborah to put on her uniform again. For her, it was worth giving up sleep. So she and her daughter rode the private elevator upward, watching the city shrink into a glittering patchwork below. Naomi clutched her backpack, carrying a half-eaten apple, a water bottle, and an old book of Japanese folktales her grandfather had once given her. Her grandfather, Leonard Carter, had taught her hiragana and katakana, then kanji, not for showing off, but for understanding the way another culture gave weight to words and honor. That battered book was her treasure, a warm shelter in cold spaces, a link to the grandfather she missed deeply. She tied her curly hair into 2 braids with the same faded elastic band she always carried around her wrist. It was her little ritual: stay calm, breathe, and count to 3. The elevator doors slid open, and a wave of air heavy with money and perfume washed over them. Victoria Whitmore, Charles's wife, approached with the grace of someone carved from ice. Her platinum hair was perfect, her diamonds caught the light, but her smile never touched her eyes. She glanced down at Deborah's worn shoes, then at Naomi. 2 minutes late, she scolded. Do you realize this is a $2 billion deal? Everything must be flawless. And what is this child doing here? She doesn't belong. Deborah's shoulders tightened. She bent toward Naomi and whispered the rules of survival in such houses. Stay in the kitchen. Don't touch anything. Speak only if asked. Those words had kept them safe countless times in rooms that weren't theirs. The living room looked like a museum, furniture arranged with surgical precision, sunlight carving sharp lines across every corner. Naomi felt out of place in her faded shirt, as if she'd been pushed onto the wrong stage in the wrong costume. On the sofa, Charles's son, Brandon, lounged lazily. He spotted her backpack and smirked. Brought your crayons to play? He teased. His laugh was sharp, cruel in a way that didn't leave bruises but still stung. Naomi lowered her eyes, wishing she could disappear. Moments later, Charles Whitmore himself strode in, every movement designed to project command. His voice rolled deep, polished by years of high-stakes deals. Just then the doorbell chimed. Kenji Nakamura, the Japanese businessman, entered, small in stature yet carrying a quiet authority. 2 aides followed him, along with his American interpreter, David Miller. Kenji's bow was polite, his smile calm but unreadable, like a cool breeze cutting through the tension in the room. Deborah hurried into action, wiping counters, arranging glasses, preparing champagne. She handed Naomi a small tray of empty glasses, giving her something to do. Naomi set the tray carefully on a side table and glanced at the bilingual contract resting on the glass coffee table. Each English page was mirrored by a Japanese page, bound in leather, a golden pen placed neatly on top. Her eyes landed on the familiar Japanese characters. She didn't read it fully, just a quick scan, but something in the lines made her heart skip. Victoria floated among the guests, boasting about artwork as if showing off stock reports. Brandon added snide comments. Charles pushed the talk toward numbers, dominance, profit, market control. On the other side, Kenji spoke of partnership, trust, and shared legacy. Between them stood David, the interpreter, translating with professional polish, while Naomi stood quietly in the corner, assumed irrelevant. As laughter and glasses clinked, Naomi noticed the imbalance. Kenji's respectful silence was being treated as weakness. Brandon blocked Deborah's path deliberately, causing a few drops of champagne to spill onto the rug. He sneered, "Careful. That rug costs more than you make in a year." Across the room, Victoria's cold voice cut in, "Clumsy." Deborah bent quickly, cleaning without complaint, but Kenji's eyes narrowed. He set his untouched glass down, the smallest gesture, but enough to show he had noticed. Naomi saw it too. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory, "Honor lives in words. Words can tie or break your name." She fingered the elastic around her wrist, breathing steadily. In this room, everyone had their own language. Charles spoke money, Victoria flaunted brands, Brandon spread mockery. Only her mother wasn't allowed a voice. Naomi realized that the language she carried, Japanese, might be the one no one in this room could ignore. Then came the moment. Charles gestured for the signing to begin. The contract was placed open on the table. David assured everyone, "The Japanese version matches the English. It's just procedure." Kenji uncapped the pen, and a thin glint of light struck its barrel. Naomi had been asked to collect empty glasses near the table. She stood close enough to glimpse the Japanese text again. She read a line silently, then froze. The English version said, "The parties shall review positions in line with market changes." But the Japanese side spelled something far more dangerous. If any market in any region dropped more than 5%, all Nakamura subsidiary assets, even those unrelated to this deal, would automatically transfer to Whitmore's full control. It wasn't a minor translation difference. It was a trap. Naomi's eyes widened. Deborah noticed her daughter's frozen look and gently tugged her hand, alarmed. Brandon smirked from across the room. "Sorry, kid. No cartoons in those papers." Charles growled impatiently. "Deborah, get her out of here." But Kenji had paused, his pen hovering just above the signature line. His eyes flicked toward Naomi, quiet but questioning. In that razor-thin instant, Naomi felt the weight of every unspoken rule: stay silent, stay small, survive. She remembered her grandfather's lessons, the kanji he had traced with her under warm light. She felt the elastic snap against her wrist. The room was silent except for the hum of the air vents. Kenji's pen touched the page. Naomi lifted her chin, her voice barely above a whisper, but clear enough to slice through the stillness. "That's not what it says." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. The polished world of power froze. Charles's grin faltered. Victoria's step wavered. Brandon's smirk stiffened. Deborah's breath caught as she clutched her daughter's hand. Kenji set the pen down. He leaned forward slightly, not toward Charles or the others, but toward the girl with the tray still in her hands. In Japanese, his voice calm and deliberate, he asked, "What did you just say?" Naomi bowed her head slightly and replied, also in Japanese, the words her grandfather had taught her echoing flawlessly. Naomi's words floated in the room longer than they should have, as if the walls themselves were holding onto them. "That's not what it says." Kenji Nakamura's dark eyes did not move from her. He repeated his question in Japanese, his tone steady but with a weight that pressed on everyone present. "Can you show me what you mean?" Naomi took a breath. Her small hands trembled as she set the tray down on the edge of the table. She leaned forward and pointed to the Japanese column on the contract, her finger brushing lightly across the characters. Then, with a clear voice far more controlled than anyone expected from a 12-year-old, she read the lines aloud in Japanese. Each syllable was crisp, drilled into her by nights at her grandfather's kitchen table. When she finished, she raised her head. Her eyes flicked between Kenji and the interpreter, then to Charles Whitmore himself. Switching to English, she said firmly, "It says if any market falls more than 5%, even if it has nothing to do with this project, all Nakamura assets would be seized as collateral and handed to Whitmore Global. But here," she tapped the English column, "it only says both parties will review positions with market shifts. No mention of collateral. No mention of full control." The silence that followed was thick and unbearable. For a moment, all anyone could hear was the faint hum of the city below. Charles's jaw tightened. He let out a sharp laugh, trying to brush it away. Ridiculous. She's a child. She doesn't understand what she's reading. He snapped at Deborah. Get her out. Now. Brandon leaned back on the sofa, smirking. Guess she thinks grown-up papers have cartoons hidden inside. His laugh landed flat. But Kenji didn't laugh. He looked directly at Naomi, ignoring the billionaire and his family. In Japanese he asked, "Who taught you?" "My grandfather," Naomi answered softly, bowing slightly in respect. He said words hold honor. And here the words are not the same. The interpreter, David Miller, suddenly shifted in his seat. Sweat broke across his brow. His hands fidgeted as if a spotlight had been turned on him. Kenji's eyes narrowed. In English, so that the entire room could hear, he asked, "Mr. Miller, did you translate this section correctly?" The weight of the question dropped like a stone. David swallowed hard. 5 seconds passed, then 10. Charles's glare burned into him like a threat. Finally, David's shoulders slumped. His voice cracked. I'm sorry. I didn't. I was told it was just a minor adjustment. They said the Japanese side would trust the English version. I was paid extra." The confession hung in the air. Deborah squeezed Naomi's hand tight as if to anchor her. Kenji reached forward and closed the contract gently. "Enough," he said quietly. Charles slammed his palm on the glass table, his voice thundering. "You coward. You'll regret this." He spun toward Deborah and Naomi, his face flushed with rage. "You think you can walk into my house and destroy a $2 billion deal? You and your little brat will never work anywhere in this city again." But as he advanced, one of Kenji's aides stepped forward and placed a firm hand on Charles's chest. He didn't shove, just held his ground, drawing a clear line. The message was unmistakable. Enough. Kenji calmly slid the pen back into its case and closed it with a click. Then he spoke in English, his voice cool and precise. "We stop here." 3 words, yet they sliced through Charles's empire like a blade. Victoria scrambled to salvage the situation. Her fake smile cracked as she rushed forward. "This is just a misunderstanding. A few lines lost in translation. We'll fix it, no need to spoil the evening." But her words fell flat. The room was no longer hers to control. Brandon tried to laugh it off, but no one joined him. The laughter that had once filled the space had drained away, leaving only unease. Kenji turned back to Naomi and bowed slightly, a gesture of deep respect. "You are very brave," he said softly. Then he glanced at Deborah. "And you are very strong." For the first time in years, Deborah felt seen, not as a servant, not as someone who had to lower her eyes and apologize for breathing, but as a mother standing tall. Charles, desperate, tried another tactic. "Kenji, we can adjust the numbers. 2 billion can become 2.5. Whatever you want. Just name it." His hands spread wide, pretending generosity, but his eyes were sharp with panic. Kenji didn't respond. Instead, he motioned for his aides to bring in a device. They placed the English and Japanese documents side by side, projecting the text clearly on a screen. The discrepancies were undeniable. David handed over emails and transfer records, his face pale as he admitted to receiving a $20,000 wire. The evidence was laid out plainly. One by one, the Whitmore's allies in the room, those who had laughed at Brandon's jokes or smiled at Victoria's arrogance, began to shift uncomfortably, avoiding Charles's eyes. When the scent of money faded, fear rose quickly in its place. Victoria bit her lip hard, her diamonds no longer sparkling but trembling. Brandon slumped against the sofa, muttering curses under his breath. Kenji finally spoke again. His voice was calm, but each word was a door closing. "Tonight, no signing." He looked at Charles with steady eyes. "We will let the lawyers speak." Then he turned back to Naomi. "Your name?" "Naomi Carter," she replied. "And your grandfather?" "Leonard Carter." Her voice caught, but she said it with pride. Kenji repeated the name slowly as though testing its weight. His expression softened for the first time that evening. "Leonard Carter? He let the name linger, almost reverent. Then he nodded to his aides. "We are finished here." Charles exploded. "You're making a mistake. Do you know what this will cost you?" Kenji didn't look at him. He simply placed a hand on Naomi's shoulder and inclined his head. "Some things cost more than money." As he led Deborah and Naomi toward the elevator, Charles shouted after them, his voice breaking, but no one in the room moved to follow. Even those who had once bowed to him now stayed rooted in their chairs, unwilling to stand by a man whose empire had just cracked open. Not by another billionaire, not by a boardroom coup, but by the voice of a maid's 12-year-old daughter who dared to speak. The elevator doors slid shut, sealing off the chaos behind them. For a moment, Deborah, Naomi, and Kenji stood in silence, the hum of the descending lift the only sound. Naomi clutched her backpack against her chest, her fingers brushing the worn cover of the folktale book inside. Her mother's hand was warm but trembling, squeezed tightly around hers. Kenji stood straight, his expression calm but unreadable, his hands resting lightly on his knees. When the elevator opened into the lobby, the city's golden lights poured in through tall glass walls. Outside, the streets glowed under street lamps, cars streaming by like veins of fire. A sleek black car waited at the curb, a driver already holding the door open. Deborah hesitated, tugging Naomi gently. "We'll take the bus," she murmured, her voice low, almost apologetic. Kenji shook his head. "Not tonight. Tonight I take you home." There was no arrogance in his tone, only quiet certainty. Deborah swallowed hard, unsure whether to resist or allow this unexpected kindness. She nodded faintly and led Naomi toward the car. The driver bowed slightly as they entered. Naomi slid into the seat beside her mother, still gripping her backpack. Kenji sat across from them, resting his wallet on his knee with both hands covering it. The car pulled away from the glittering tower that Charles Whitmore had believed was unshakable. For years he thought everything could be bought with numbers. Tonight numbers had failed him. Inside the car, silence lingered until Kenji finally spoke, his voice softer than it had been upstairs. "Leonard Carter. Was that your grandfather?" Naomi nodded quickly. "Yes. He taught me Japanese. He made me copy kanji over and over until I got them right." Kenji looked down at the wallet in his hands. Slowly he pulled it open and drew out a folded, yellowed photograph. The edges were frayed, the black and white image faded with time, but the faces in it were clear. Two young men sat side by side on broken stones. One a Japanese student in torn uniform, the other an American soldier with dust on his face but kindness in his eyes. Between them they held half of a chocolate bar. Naomi gasped, her hand rising toward the picture but stopping short. "That's him. Grandpa." Deborah's hand flew to her mouth, tears streaming before she could stop them. Kenji's eyes darkened, though not with anger. "With memory." "The Japanese man," he said quietly, "was my grandfather, Haruto Nakamura. He told my father that during the war in Okinawa, an American soldier saved his life. He said the soldier's name was Carter. He carried this photograph his whole life and told us, if you ever meet a Carter, treat them as family." Naomi blinked rapidly, her voice breaking. "Grandpa used to say, he met a Japanese boy with sad eyes. They couldn't speak the same language but they understood each other. He said it was the only time during the war he felt human again." Kenji bowed his head deeply, the gesture formal and reverent. "Then it is true. Your grandfather was that soldier. And my family has owed yours a debt of honor for more than 70 years. Deborah wiped her tears quickly, ashamed of letting them fall in front of a man so composed. "Please," she whispered. "You don't owe us anything. We're fine." Kenji's gaze was steady, his words firm. "This is not kindness. This is repayment. Tonight you saved not only me but my company, my family's legacy. That debt will not be ignored." The car rolled through quieter streets now, turning down a narrow block lined with dim apartment buildings. Curtains twitched as curious neighbors noticed the black car outside. Deborah guided Kenji to their worn building, its peeling paint and flickering hallway lights revealing years of neglect. "I'll walk you to the door," Kenji said. Deborah shook her head quickly. "No, please. It's not necessary. But Kenji stepped out anyway. His movements weren't gallant or showy, they were deliberate, carrying the weight of a man who believed in keeping his word. The driver followed behind, carrying nothing, only watching respectfully. Up the stairwell, the hum of old lights echoed. Naomi pulled her keys from her backpack and unlocked the door to their small apartment. The air inside smelled faintly of soap and dampness. The thin carpet was worn, the furniture mismatched. Deborah turned to face Kenji. Her voice was steadier now. "Thank you. Truly." Kenji handed her a small card. "Tomorrow at 9 in the morning my assistant Emmy will call. She will explain everything. Please take the call." He then bowed deeply to Naomi. "You saved many people tonight from a lie written in ink. Your grandfather would be proud." Naomi's chest swelled, though she lowered her eyes modestly. Deborah's lips trembled, but she managed to say the words clearly, "Thank you." Kenji gave a final nod, then turned and left. The black car pulled away from the curb, quiet as a shadow. Inside, Deborah shut the door and leaned back against it. A shaky laugh escaped her, quickly turning into sobs. Naomi rushed forward and wrapped her arms around her, feeling the tremble in her mother's back, the tremble of release, not fear. On the small kitchen table, Naomi set down her backpack. The book of Japanese folktales slipped out, falling open to a page her grandfather had once marked. She traced the characters slowly, whispering under her breath. "Those who choose honor don't do it because they know they will win. They do it because they refuse to lose themselves." Naomi closed the book, her eyes heavy. For the first time in months, when she finally laid down to sleep, she didn't dream of endless hallways with no exit. She dreamed of her grandfather's voice and the warmth of honor that stretched across generations. Tomorrow would come quickly. And with it, the call at 9 o'clock sharp. Morning sunlight filtered through the cracked blinds of the Carters' apartment. The hum of traffic outside was steady, a reminder that the world kept moving even after the night that had changed everything. Deborah stood by the counter boiling water for tea, her hands still trembling faintly from exhaustion and disbelief. Naomi sat at the table, her folktale book open, tracing characters with her finger. Neither spoke much. Both knew they were waiting for the call. At exactly 9 o'clock the phone buzzed. Deborah startled, nearly spilling her cup. She picked up cautiously. "Good morning, Mrs. Carter. My name is Emmy. I am Mr. Nakamura's assistant. I'm calling on his instruction." The voice was calm, steady, with the kind of professional warmth that put Deborah immediately at ease. She clutched the phone tighter. "Yes, I'm listening." Emmy explained everything carefully, each sentence deliberate. "First, an account has been opened to clear your debts and provide for living expenses. Second, a trust has been established for your daughter, Naomi, covering her education through university. Third, a new apartment has been arranged for you in a safe neighborhood, close to a good school and a park. The rent and utilities are already handled for the first 6 months. You will receive your new phone number today so you are protected from any harassment. Your current number will no longer be listed publicly." Deborah sank into the chair, pressing her free hand over her mouth. I don't know what to say." "You only need to say received," Emmy replied gently. "The rest is yours to focus on being a mother." For the first time in years, Deborah laughed through her tears. "Yes, received." 3 days later, a moving truck pulled up in front of a modest building painted white, its windows framed neatly, its hallways smelling faintly of polished wood. Deborah carried a bundle of dishes wrapped in newspaper, Naomi a box of books light enough for her small arms. The new apartment was clean, airy, with sunlight spilling through wide windows. In the living room, a soft green armchair faced an oak tree outside. Naomi smiled and touched the fabric. "This one's for Grandpa," she whispered. Deborah nodded, running her hand across the chair's arm as if confirming it belonged. In the kitchen, a pot of soup simmered on the stove, the smell of toasted bread drifting warmly through the room. For once, their home smelled like comfort instead of exhaustion. On the 4th day, Emmy herself visited, carrying a neat stack of hardbound books, translations of Japanese literature with English printed side by side. "From Mr. Nakamura," she said, placing them in Naomi's hands. "He asked me to tell you to read slowly. Naomi's eyes glowed as she hugged the books to her chest. "Thank you," she whispered. Emmy shook her head softly. "No. Thank you for those 4 words." Across the city, Whitmore Global was groaning under pressure. In a glass-walled boardroom, Charles faced a line of lawyers, their expressions cold and severe. The stock chart on the screen flickered like a failing heartbeat, plunging downward by the hour. Kenji had formally withdrawn from the deal, citing ethical violations. His statement was simple but devastating. All further communication must go through lawyers. By noon, the Chicago Financial Times ran a headline, "Bilingual Contract Reveals Deception in $2 billion Deal." Side-by-side text showed the English and Japanese versions, 4 phrases highlighted in red. The source? A surprising reader of Japanese. The market reacted instantly. Whitmore shares collapsed in a single session. Investors pulled back, partnerships wavered, and the empire Charles had spent decades constructing began to crumble in real time. At home in their new apartment, Naomi curled up in the green chair with one of her new books. Deborah placed 2 bowls of soup on the table, the steam curling gently in the air. "You okay?" she asked softly. Naomi smiled faintly, lifting her eyes. "I think Grandpa is sitting right here." She pointed to the empty chair across from her. Deborah followed her gaze, her eyes filling again. She nodded slowly. "Yes, he is." The phone buzzed again. This time it was Kenji. His voice carried the same calm strength it always had. "Naomi," he said warmly. "Did you get the books?" "Yes, sir," she answered. "Read slowly," he reminded her. Then after a pause, his tone softened further. "And don't forget Joy." Naomi's lips curved into a smile. "One more thing," Kenji added. "The day after tomorrow I'd like to take you and your mother somewhere. A place with rows of white stones." Naomi's heart skipped. She knew exactly where he meant, the military cemetery where her grandfather's name was carved. That night, she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her hand resting on the worn folktale book. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't uncertain. She knew tomorrow would come, and with it, the walk among those white stones where promises crossed oceans and decades to meet again. The morning of the visit was clear, the sky pale blue with thin white clouds stretched like chalk lines. The black car glided through Chicago's busy streets, then moved steadily uphill, away from the noise of honking horns and flashing lights. Inside, Naomi sat between her mother and Kenji, her backpack resting on her lap. She had slipped a folded sheet of paper inside it. One her grandfather had once made her copy over and over, characters for duty and honor drawn in pencil. The road narrowed as they approached the military cemetery. Silence settled naturally as though even the city itself was bowing. Rows of white headstones came into view, each one identical, stretching out evenly like breaths frozen in stone. Kenji asked the driver to stop at a distance. "We'll walk from here," he said quietly. Not as ceremony, just to give the words a headspace to land. They walked side by side, their footsteps crunching against gravel. Naomi held her mother's hand, her other hand clutching the strap of her backpack. The air smelled of cut grass, carrying a stillness that pressed gently on their chests. Sunlight caught the stone edges, highlighting names carved into them. Kenji stopped before one. Walter Leonard Carter. The letters were simple, chiseled without ornament, but they carried more weight than any contract Naomi had ever seen. Kenji bowed deeply, his forehead nearly touching the ground. "When you owe a debt," he murmured, "you let your head meet the earth." Deborah froze, her voice breaking. "He's here." Her knees trembled, but Naomi steadied her with a soft tug of her hand. Together they knelt. Naomi placed a bundle of white chrysanthemums at the base of the headstone. Her fingertips brushed the carved letters. She whispered, "Hi, Grandpa." The wind lifted softly, brushing her braids with the faint smell of coconut oil. She didn't cry. She didn't need to. She felt him there, not just in stone, but in the lesson that had carried her through the penthouse that night. Honor lives in words. Kenji reached into his pocket and carefully drew out the black and white photo again. He placed it gently against the headstone, pressing it down with his fingertips. "I promised not to open this in Whitmore's house," he said. But here it's allowed. Naomi leaned closer, seeing the same picture she had studied days before. Her grandfather, young, dusty-faced but kind-eyed, sharing a chocolate bar with the gaunt Japanese student who was Kenji's grandfather. Their faint smiles weren't triumphant. They weren't proud. They were human, unafraid for just one moment. Kenji's voice lowered. Haruto told my father and my father told me, if you meet a Carter, treat them as family. Today I keep that promise. He reached for his wallet again, pulling out a thin envelope worn with years. This letter was written by my grandfather decades ago, through veterans networks. He was searching for Walter Carter to say thank you. The letter never reached him. Perhaps the address changed. Perhaps it was lost. Haruto died before he could send his gratitude in person. He unfolded the paper carefully, laying it across the stone. The Japanese script flowed across it like brushstrokes, a thank you frozen in time. He carried this his whole life, waiting for the moment. Now I place it here where it belongs. Naomi stared at the letter, feeling it as a bridge stretched across oceans and years. Would Grandpa be happy to meet you? She asked softly. Kenji looked at her, his eyes glimmering. Very happy. He pressed his palm flat against the stone. Walter, thank you. I keep Haruto's word. He turned to Deborah then, his voice steady but softened. The Tanaka Foundation has created a trust for Naomi. Any school, anywhere, full tuition, housing, books, a stipend. You will not trade sleep for bills any longer. This is not charity. This is repayment. You owe me nothing. I owe your family. Deborah's throat tightened. You've already done too much. We only want peace. Kenji gave a small nod. Then accept it as peace. Honor must travel forward. One day Naomi will pass it on. He scribbled something on the back of his card and handed it to her. Emmy's number. She will arrange a school visit, an academic advisor. Read slowly, he said to Naomi, his eyes softening into something almost paternal. And keep joy. They lingered a few minutes longer, the breeze rustling through the rows of white stones. Birds chirped somewhere above, their notes breaking the silence gently. Naomi opened her folktale book, her voice steady as she read aloud a short passage, her tongue forming the kanji her grandfather had once made her repeat. Kenji closed his eyes and listened, as if hearing a song from his own homeland. Before they left, Naomi pulled out her pencil. With Kenji's nod, she wrote 2 small characters on the back of the photograph. Arigato. Thank you. She handed the picture back to Kenji. He tucked it carefully into his wallet, closing it like sealing a memory back into his heart. Deborah wiped her face, inhaled deeply, and managed a small smile Naomi hadn't seen in a long time. All right, she whispered. Let's get lunch. They stopped at a small ramen shop nearby, its glass fogged with steam from boiling pots. The owner greeted Kenji warmly, bowing as he led them to a wooden table. Kenji ordered shoyu ramen, Deborah udon, and Naomi miso. When the bowls arrived, steam rose in fragrant curls. Kenji lifted his chopsticks, bowed his head slightly, and said, "Itadakimasu." Naomi echoed the word carefully. Deborah smiled and joined them. They ate quietly, not the silence of fear but the silence of trust. Between bites, Kenji shared stories about his grandfather's love of poetry. Naomi spoke about her grandfather's peppermint candies and the way he used to sneak them into her school bag. Deborah added small details from their new neighborhood. The kind security guard, the oak tree outside their window, the children playing in the park. For the first time in years, their words weren't whispers of survival. They were stories, exchanged freely, building a bridge across 2 families that had once shared a piece of chocolate in the ruins of war. By the time the bowls were empty, the air in the ramen shop felt lighter, like they had shed something heavy. Naomi leaned back, satisfied in a way that wasn't just about food. Deborah dabbed her lips with a napkin, her posture straighter than usual, her eyes more relaxed. Kenji placed his chopsticks carefully across his bowl, every gesture deliberate, as though he lived by rhythm as much as by reason. When they stepped outside, the sunlight had shifted golden, laying soft patterns on the sidewalks. The car was waiting, but Kenji didn't hurry them. He walked at their pace as if giving them room to breathe in this new chapter. They drove to the nearby high school. The principal, a tall woman with warm eyes, greeted them firmly with a handshake. "Miss Carter, we're honored to have you here. We'll arrange placement tests especially for your Japanese skills. We've never had a student come in this advanced." Naomi's cheeks flushed, her braids bouncing as she nodded politely. She wandered down the hallway with her mother beside her, touching her hand against the lockers. The smell of paper, pencils and floor wax was ordinary, but to Naomi, it felt safe, far safer than the mirrored corridors of Whitmore's penthouse. Kenji kept to the side, giving space, but his gaze followed Naomi with quiet pride, as though he had known her far longer than a week. By evening the car brought them home. At the building's entrance, Deborah turned back, her voice steady though tinged with wonder. "I don't know how I could ever repay you." Kenji's smile was gentle, but his words were firm. "Repayment goes forward. One day when Naomi is grown and sees someone smaller, weaker, who cannot speak for themselves, she must speak. That is enough. That is the only repayment I ask." He pressed a hand to his chest where the wallet with the photograph lay. "Your grandfather did it. Now she will." The elevator doors closed behind him, leaving mother and daughter in the quiet lobby. Naomi tilted her head up at the buzzing light above, thinking about the ramen, the white gravestones, the pen that had saved the night. A short word rose in her chest, one her grandfather had made her write again and again. Honor. That evening, Deborah set 2 mugs of warm milk on the small table. Naomi opened a book from the stack Emmy had brought, Akutagawa's short stories in bilingual format. She read aloud slowly, stumbling once, then correcting herself. Her mother smiled, listening with eyes closed, letting the words wash over her like a lullaby. Meanwhile, across the city, the Whitmore mansion was turning into a cage. Charles paced across the Italian rug that only days ago had been stained by spilled champagne. Now every step sounded hollow. Victoria rehearsed apology statements in front of the mirror, her tone brittle, her eyes desperate. Brandon sat in his gaming chair, his controller unplugged, staring at the screen as though the glow might save him. Invitations to galas and charity boards vanished overnight. Investors pulled out. Colleagues avoided eye contact. The name Whitmore, once polished, now carried the stink of betrayal. A week later, Naomi sent her first letter to Kenji. She used the fountain pen he had given her, its nib smooth and sharp, urging her to go slowly. She wrote about small things, how she had reached page 20 of Kawabata, how a new friend named Maya liked skateboarding, how another boy named Eli always wore a cap even indoors. She described the oak tree outside their window, its leaves rustling like whispers, and ended with, "Grandpa would like the oak tree." She pressed a dried leaf into the envelope and gave it to Emmy, who visited the next morning. Kenji replied a few days later with his own letter, written in clean strokes of Japanese. He told her about his rooftop rock garden, the miso soup he had tried to cook and failed, and a short haiku by Basho. An old pond. A frog leaps in. Sound of water. At the bottom he added, "Short like your 4 words." Naomi smiled when she read it, tracing each character slowly, savoring them as though they were pieces of candy. As the months rolled on, life in their new neighborhood began to settle into rhythm. Deborah found joy in small routines. She started working mornings at the local library, shelving books, pointing children to the right aisles, even reading stories aloud during the weekly kids' hour. The job was light, but it filled her heart in ways that scrubbing marble counters never had. She often thought of Kenji's words, "This is not charity. This is repayment." One afternoon, Emmy arrived at the library carrying a slim wooden box. Inside was a reprinted photograph, Walter Carter and Haruto Nakamura sitting side by side, sharing chocolate. The frame was simple wood, but beneath it was a small engraving, Room of Honor. The Tanaka Foundation had sponsored a new reading corner in the library, complete with fresh shelves, a glass cabinet, and a wall panel telling the story of 2 young men who once met in war. Deborah touched the frame, her fingers trembling as though she were opening a window to the past. On a bright Saturday, the reading corner opened. Children dashed about with paper fans, elderly women filled the front row. Naomi stood on a small platform, reading a passage from Kawabata slowly, carefully, in both English and Japanese. When she finished, the room erupted in applause. Kenji stood at the back, his gray coat draped neatly, a maple leaf pin on his lapel. His hands clapped in steady rhythm, his eyes glistening with quiet pride. On the wall, Walter and Haruto's photographs smiled faintly at the gathering. Two men who had once shared a chocolate bar now shared a room of honor across an ocean and a lifetime. That evening, Naomi sat in the green chair at home, her pen poised over fresh paper. She wrote her second letter, describing the library opening, the children's laughter, the oak trees changing leaves. She ended with, "Thank you for letting me keep my bridge." Her mother placed a mug of cocoa on the table, clinking it gently against Naomi's. "Finished?" she asked. "Finished," Naomi said with a smile. Outside, the yellow curtains swayed in the evening breeze. Inside, the room glowed with warmth, and for once, they felt not like guests in someone else's world, but like family in their own. Autumn rolled in quietly, brushing the streets with cool wind and painting the oak tree outside Naomi's window gold. School days passed in rhythm. Morning buses, math quizzes, lunch under the basketball hoop, then afternoons in the library where Naomi often waited for her mother to finish shelving books. Each evening she returned to her folktale book or her letters with Kenji. But while Naomi's life was beginning to stretch forward with color, the Whitmore's empire was shrinking into shadow. Charles's office, once the center of power, now felt like a cage of glass. Reporters gathered outside the building daily, their cameras flashing, their questions sharp as knives. "Mr. Whitmore, do you admit to falsifying the contract? Did you bribe the interpreter? Were you aware of the discrepancies?" Charles barked no comment again and again, but his words no longer carried authority. His voice cracked, his eyes darted, his shoulders slumped. Victoria tried to hold onto her social throne. She threw a charity luncheon, but half the guests failed to arrive, and the few who did only came to watch her stumble. Photographers caught her sipping wine too fast, her diamond bracelet slipping down her arm like dead weight. Brandon, once smug and untouchable, faced jeers on social media, his comments filled with ridicule. His gaming livestream had shriveled to a handful of mocking viewers. Deborah heard whispers of their downfall at the grocery store, snippets of gossip murmured by cashiers and customers. "That Whitmore guy. I heard his board's pushing him out. They say his son got caught making fake accounts to harass people online. The wife. She's selling jewelry quietly. Nobody's buying." Deborah didn't join in. She simply held Naomi's hand tighter, thankful their own days no longer depended on scraps from families like that. Meanwhile, Naomi was blooming. In her new school, she stunned her teachers with her fluency test in Japanese, her calm delivery as she read aloud passages others could barely pronounce. Her math teacher praised her problem-solving skills, noting how she worked step by step, never rushing but never lost. A few classmates teased her for being bookish, but others gravitated toward her quiet strength. She began tutoring 2 students after school, helping them prepare for exams. One crisp Saturday, Naomi and Deborah were invited to a formal dinner hosted by Kenji. The restaurant was small but elegant, hidden on a quiet street. Lanterns glowed softly outside, their warm light spilling across the pavement. Inside, the tables were low, the walls lined with calligraphy scrolls. Emmy greeted them at the entrance, her smile as steady as ever. Kenji rose from his seat when they entered, bowing slightly. "Welcome," he said. "Tonight is not business. Tonight is thanks." The meal unfolded gently, course by course. Miso soup, grilled fish, rice, delicate pickles. Naomi tried each dish carefully, savoring the flavors. Deborah followed, her nerves settling as the warmth of the food and the kindness of the company wrapped around her like a blanket. Midway through, Kenji placed a small box in front of Naomi. She looked up, startled. "Open it," he urged softly. Inside was a fountain pen, slimmer than the one before, engraved with 2 characters, courage and honor. Naomi held it carefully, her fingers trembling slightly. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Kenji nodded. "Words saved us that night. Words will guide you always. But courage must sit with them or they are only noise." Naomi pressed her lips together, her eyes wet. She nodded firmly. I'll use it slowly, she promised. Deborah's throat tightened as she watched her daughter accept the gift with such poise. For years she had feared Naomi would only ever be seen as a maid's child, brushed aside, invisible. Now before her eyes she was being treated as something different, a voice that mattered. Toward the end of the meal, Kenji leaned forward slightly, his gaze thoughtful. Naomi, he said, one day you may face people who laugh at you again. Not because you are wrong but because they fear what you know. When that happens, remember the pen. Speak clearly with honor. The laughter will not last. But your words will. Naomi swallowed hard, her small fingers tightening around the pen. I'll remember. After dinner, Emmy drove them home. The city lights glittered outside the window, but Deborah wasn't watching them. She was watching Naomi, who sat upright, her new pen clutched against her chest like a torch. That night, Deborah placed a hand on her daughter's forehead as she tucked her into bed. You're not just my little girl anymore, she whispered. You're my bridge. Naomi smiled sleepily. Grandpa's bridge too. Yes, Deborah said softly, brushing a braid back from her face. Grandpa's bridge too. Outside, the oak tree rustled in the autumn wind, its golden leaves falling one by one, covering the ground like quiet applause for the girl who had spoken when it mattered most. Winter crept into the city slowly, frosting the windows of buses, painting the sidewalks with patches of white, and stiffening the oak tree outside Naomi's window. She pressed her finger against the glass one morning, tracing the thin lines of ice, watching her breath fog the pain. School days were shorter now, evenings darker, but inside their apartment warmth grew steadily. Deborah adjusted well to her new job at the library. She walked with steadier steps now, no longer hunched by exhaustion. The staff admired her organization, her calm manner with children, her smile that grew freer each week. On Fridays she and Naomi often stayed after closing, sharing leftover cookies from story hour and arranging books together, their laughter soft under the fluorescent lights. Naomi thrived in her classes. She joined the school's debate team, surprising even herself when she raised her hand to volunteer. Her first round was shaky, her voice trembled, her palms sweated, but when she remembered Kenji's words about courage and honor, she steadied. Slowly the room listened. Her teammates began turning to her for guidance, and soon she was the one drafting arguments late at night, her fountain pen scratching across notebooks, the engraved characters reminding her who she was becoming. Meanwhile, the Whitmores sank deeper into ruin. Charles was pushed out by his board, his name scrubbed from company documents. He raged in private, his shouts echoing down empty hallways. Victoria's jewels went to auction, but bids came back low. Her former friends whispered behind closed doors. Brandon dropped out of college quietly, avoiding questions, his online presence a ghost of what it once was. The city that had once bowed to the Whitmores now turned its back. One evening, as Deborah folded laundry, the phone rang. It was Emmy. Naomi has been nominated for the state-level Japanese language competition, she announced warmly. Mr. Nakamura thought you should know right away. Deborah froze, holding a shirt in her hands. What? Oh. She's only been here a few months. Talent? Emmy replied simply. And courage. She will compete in February. Kenji will attend. Deborah's eyes welled with tears. She turned to Naomi, who stood in the doorway, her eyes wide, her hands pressed to her chest. Mama, did she say February? Deborah nodded, and Naomi burst into laughter, the sound ringing like bells through the apartment. The weeks leading up to the competition were filled with practice. Naomi spent evenings reciting passages, sometimes in front of her mother, sometimes into the bathroom mirror. She stumbled, corrected, improved. Her classmates cheered her on, some offering to quiz her with flashcards. Her teacher, Ms. Reyes, stayed after school helping her polish pronunciation. You don't just sound fluent, she told her. You sound alive in it. Kenji sent her small notes of encouragement. Read slowly. Keep joy. And breathe before each sentence as if the words are stepping stones. Naomi tucked the notes inside her backpack, pulling them out before every practice. The day of the competition arrived cold and sharp, the sky gray, the air biting. The event hall buzzed with parents, teachers, and students from across the state. Deborah held Naomi's coat tightly, adjusting her scarf as though she were still a little girl. "You're ready?" she whispered. "Don't forget that." Kenji arrived just before the first round, his coat dusted with snow. He bowed slightly to Deborah, then placed a reassuring hand on Naomi's shoulder. "Tonight, your grandfather walks with you." Naomi nodded, her heart steadying. The competition began. Students took the stage one by one, reading passages, answering questions, translating sentences. Some spoke smoothly, others stumbled. When Naomi's name was called, she walked forward with her notebook pressed against her chest. She bowed lightly to the judges, then lifted her fountain pen as if it were a talisman. She began slowly, her voice clear and measured. The first passage rolled off her tongue with practiced ease. She translated the second question with calm precision. When the judges pressed with a complex phrase, she paused, inhaled deeply, and then delivered the answer with steady confidence. The room was silent as she spoke, not out of politeness but out of respect. For a moment, everyone forgot she was 12. She sounded like someone carrying something far older than her years. When she finished, applause erupted. Deborah clutched her hands together, whispering, "Thank you, God. Thank you." Kenji nodded slowly, pride glimmering in his eyes but his expression as composed as ever. Hours later, when the results were announced, Naomi's name rose to the top. First place. The medal gleamed around her neck, the ribbon brushing against her sweater. She stood on stage, smiling shyly as cameras flashed. Deborah cried openly, not caring who saw. Kenji clapped with the same steady rhythm he always carried, his eyes fixed on Naomi as though watching a promise fulfilled. That night, as they returned home, Naomi sat in the green chair, the medal still around her neck. She opened her notebook and wrote a short letter. "Grandpa, I won today. I think you'd laugh at how nervous I was. But I remembered your words and Kenji's too. I'm still your bridge. Always." She tucked the letter inside her folktale book, the medal resting beside it. The oak tree outside swayed under the winter wind, its bare branches creaking. But inside their apartment, warmth glowed steady, carrying them into the next chapter of their journey. The weeks after the competition unfolded like a new season in Naomi's life. Her medal hung proudly on the wall above her desk, catching sunlight each morning. Teachers congratulated her, classmates asked for her help with homework, and even strangers at the library whispered about the little girl who speaks Japanese like she was born there. Deborah carried quiet pride with her everywhere she went. Every time she looked at her daughter, she saw not only Naomi but also the shadow of Walter Carter's legacy, alive in her voice. But while Naomi's world expanded, the Whitmores collapsed further. The financial press revealed deeper layers of deception. Investigators found evidence of forged documents and offshore accounts. Charles's face appeared nightly on the news, grim and defensive. Victoria's name was dropped from multiple charity boards. Brandon's temper exploded online, captured in viral clips that mocked him relentlessly. The empire that once stood like a fortress now looked like a crumbling ruin. Naomi didn't pay much attention to the news. She was too busy preparing for her next challenge, the national competition. Kenji himself had nominated her. When the invitation arrived in the mail, printed on thick ivory paper, Naomi held it in trembling hands. "Mama, it says Washington, D.C. Deborah nearly dropped the dish she was holding. "Washington? That's across the country." Kenji called later that evening. "She is ready," he said firmly. "I will cover all expenses. Flights, hotel, meals. This is not a gift. It is an obligation. She carries a bridge that must be walked across." Deborah pressed the phone tightly to her ear, her voice soft but steady. "Thank you. We'll go." The months leading up to the trip were filled with practice. Naomi rose before dawn to rehearse pronunciation. She stayed after school to study history, culture, and literature. Ms. Reyes worked tirelessly with her, correcting every detail. Kenji sent books and practice recordings. Emmy visited weekly, quizzing Naomi with flashcards until her brain ached. At night, Naomi sometimes grew overwhelmed. She would sit in the green chair, pen trembling in her hand, tears brimming. "What if I can't do it?" she whispered once. Deborah knelt beside her, cupping her face gently. "Naomi, you've already done more than anyone expected. Winning is not the point. Speaking is. Every time you open your mouth with courage, you've already won." The day of the trip came at last. The airport buzzed with travelers, announcements echoing through the terminals. Deborah held their tickets tightly, nerves twisting in her stomach. Naomi carried her backpack, her medal tucked safely inside, her folktale book resting on top. Kenji met them at the gate, calm and steady as ever. "Are you ready?" he asked. Naomi nodded, though her hands trembled. "Yes." The flight lifted off, the city shrinking below them, clouds swallowing the plane. Naomi pressed her forehead against the window, watching the horizon stretch endlessly. She thought of her grandfather, of the night in the Whitmore's penthouse, of the gravestones standing silent in the cold wind. She whispered softly, "I'll keep the bridge." When they landed in Washington, the air was brisk, the streets lined with monuments and history. The hotel was elegant but not overwhelming, its walls lined with framed photographs of past leaders. Naomi and Deborah shared a room, the beds soft, the view overlooking the city's glowing lights. The competition was held in a grand auditorium filled with flags from across the country. Students in neat uniforms gathered nervously, some whispering in Japanese, others practicing quietly in corners. Naomi adjusted her sweater, clutching her fountain pen. Her mother brushed a braid behind her ear. "Breathe, sweetheart. Just breathe." Kenji stood in the back, his presence calm and steady, his eyes fixed on Naomi as though anchoring her in the storm. When Naomi's name was called, she walked onto the stage. The bright lights nearly blinded her, but she steadied herself, bowing lightly. She began reading her passage, each word deliberate, her pronunciation clear. She translated complex sentences with confidence. Then came the final question, a cultural proverb, subtle and difficult. She paused, heart pounding. She closed her eyes, inhaled, and remembered Kenji's words. "Read slowly, keep joy." Her lips parted, and the answer flowed, not just in Japanese but in English as well, explaining the meaning and its lesson about perseverance. Her voice did not shake. It rang steady, carrying across the auditorium. When she finished, the room erupted into applause. Deborah covered her mouth with both hands, tears streaming freely. Kenji nodded slowly, his hands clapping in rhythm, his eyes glimmering with quiet pride. That evening in their hotel room, Naomi placed her medal and certificate on the desk. She opened her folktale book, slipping in a fresh sheet of paper. She wrote, "Grandpa, today I spoke for both of us. I think the boy with the sad eyes heard me too." She tucked the letter inside the book, closed it carefully, and turned off the lamp. As she drifted into sleep, the city outside pulsed with light, but inside, the quiet glow of honor stretched across time, steady as ever. The return from Washington felt like carrying a new world inside their luggage. Naomi clutched her medal, her certificate rolled carefully in a tube, and her fountain pen secure in her pocket. Deborah walked taller than before, her steps confident as they moved through the airport terminal. Kenji followed behind them, silent but steady, like a guardian who needed no words. Back in Chicago, the air felt colder, but inside their apartment, warmth grew stronger than ever. The medal hung on the wall above Naomi's desk beside the state award, and each night she looked at it before opening her books. Her life was changing, but she never forgot the night in the Whitmore's penthouse, the moment she had chosen to speak. Meanwhile, the Whitmore's downfall was no longer whispered gossip, it was front-page news. Charles faced federal investigations, accused of fraud, bribery, and falsifying documents. Cameras caught him leaving courtrooms with a face carved from stone, refusing to answer questions. Victoria withdrew completely, her social invitations vanished, her phone calls ignored. Brandon drifted aimlessly, his arrogance turned bitter, his name mocked online with every post. The empire they had built on arrogance was crumbling into dust. At the library, Deborah found herself more than an employee. Parents began asking her advice on books for their children. The head librarian offered her extra hours. She felt useful, valued, respected, not as someone who served quietly in the background, but as a woman whose presence mattered. She sometimes paused by the framed photograph in the room of honor, resting her hand against the glass. "We're still keeping the bridge," she whispered. For Naomi, life became a rhythm of school, books, and letters. She wrote regularly to Kenji, describing her progress, her small triumphs, even her struggles. He always replied with words of encouragement, sometimes including a haiku, sometimes sharing a memory of his grandfather. His letters carried a kind of patience Naomi had never known from anyone else. One snowy evening, Kenji invited them to dinner at his home. The building stood tall and elegant, but not intimidating. Inside, the walls were lined with scrolls and soft light glowed from paper lamps. A rock garden stretched across the balcony, stones arranged carefully in patterns. Naomi knelt beside it, tracing the air above the lines. "It's like my writing practice," she said softly. Kenji smiled faintly. "Yes. Every stroke deliberate. Nothing wasted." They dined simply, grilled fish, rice and miso soup. Deborah marveled at the quiet elegance of the meal, so different from the lavish excess she had once served in Whitmore's mansion. It wasn't wealth that impressed her, it was the dignity that filled every corner of the home. After dinner, Kenji opened a wooden box and placed it in front of Naomi. Inside lay a folded sheet of rice paper. "This is the last letter my grandfather wrote before he passed," he said quietly. "It is written in simple Japanese. I want you to read it." Naomi's hands trembled as she lifted the paper. Slowly she began sounding out the characters. She stumbled once, then again, but she pushed forward, her voice steadying as she continued. The letter spoke of gratitude, for survival, for kindness received, for the chocolate bar shared in war. It ended with a single line: "If you find the Carter family, bow until your head touches the earth." When Naomi finished, silence filled the room. Her mother's eyes glistened, Kenji's gaze lowered, his hands folded carefully in his lap. Naomi set the letter back into the box gently, as though returning a treasure to its rightful place. Kenji looked at her then, his voice quiet but strong. "You are the fulfillment of that promise. You and your grandfather both." Naomi swallowed, her chest heavy with emotion. "I'll carry it forward," she whispered. Kenji nodded. "Yes. Forward." That night, as the car carried them back home, Deborah watched her daughter through the window's reflection. She no longer saw just a 12-year-old girl. She saw a voice that had stopped a billion-dollar lie, a child who had become the bridge between two families, two nations, two times. Naomi sat upright, her metal glinting faintly in the streetlights, her fountain pen in her hand. She gazed out at the city, her eyes calm and steady. She knew the road ahead would not always be easy. But she also knew she would never walk it in silence. And somewhere deep in her heart, she felt the presence of her grandfather, steady, proud, and smiling at the bridge she was building step by step. Spring came slowly, pushing the snow aside with soft rains and the smell of new grass. The oak tree outside Naomi's window stretched fresh green leaves, waving like flags in the sunlight. Naomi grew taller, her braids brushing her shoulders, her steps carrying new confidence. Her mother noticed the difference in small things. The way Naomi held her books firmly, the way her laughter rang louder, the way she spoke up in class without hesitation. Deborah herself had changed. The lines of exhaustion around her eyes had softened. She smiled more, laughed more, and even joined a community group at the library where women shared stories over coffee. For the first time in years, she was not simply surviving. She was living. One bright afternoon, Amy visited with new news. "Naomi has been invited to speak at the International Language Symposium downtown," she explained, placing the letter on their table. "She'll read a short passage in Japanese and share her experience of learning the language." Deborah blinked, stunned. "But, she's still a child." Amy smiled warmly. "Sometimes children teach the most." Naomi, sitting in her green chair, straightened. "I want to do it," she said firmly. And so began weeks of practice once again. Naomi chose a passage from her grandfather's folktale book, one he had underlined long ago. She practiced night after night, her voice clear, her fountain pen resting nearby as she rehearsed translations. The day of the symposium arrived. The hall was filled with scholars, teachers, and students from around the world. Flags lined the stage, microphones gleamed under the lights. Deborah sat nervously in the front row, her hands clenched in her lap. Kenji arrived quietly, bowing to her before taking a seat. When Naomi's name was called, she walked to the podium. Her heart pounded, but she remembered Kenji's steady gaze and her mother's proud smile. She bowed slightly, then began to read. Her voice filled the hall, soft yet commanding, childlike yet weighted with history. She recited the folktale in Japanese, then explained its meaning in English. Even when the mountain is tall, even when the path is hard, the person who walks step by step will reach the other side. Applause thundered through the room. Cameras flashed. Scholars nodded in approval. Deborah wept openly and Kenji's steady clap echoed in rhythm, his face calm but glowing with pride. Afterward, several professors approached Naomi, praising her poise and skill. One asked Deborah if Naomi would consider applying to an international academy in the future. Deborah's eyes widened, overwhelmed by how quickly doors were opening. On the way home, Naomi sat quietly staring out the car window. She held her folktale book on her lap, the medal from Washington still tucked inside. "Mama," she whispered, "I think Grandpa is happy I read his story today." Deborah stroked her daughter's hair gently. "I know he is." Across the city, the Whitmore story reached its lowest point. Charles faced indictment. Court papers were filed. His once grand mansion was now on the market, reporters swarming outside like vultures. Victoria retreated completely, hiding behind drawn curtains. Brandon disappeared from public view, his arrogance now replaced by silence. The empire had finally cracked wide open. Deborah sometimes caught herself thinking about them, not with anger but with quiet reflection. For years she had scrubbed their floors, poured their drinks, endured their dismissive stares. They had believed her and her daughter to be invisible. Now the world saw otherwise. Justice had not come with fire or fists, but with words, and those words had been spoken by a child. That evening, Naomi sat at her desk, her pen scratching across paper. She wrote a new letter. "Grandpa, today I spoke for everyone. They clapped so loud I thought the room would shake. But I wasn't afraid. I remembered your lessons. I think the bridge is getting longer and I will keep walking it." She folded the letter, tucking it inside the folktale book. She glanced at the medal, the photograph of Walter Carter and Haruto Nakamura framed on the wall, and then at her mother, who was quietly humming in the kitchen. The room felt full, not of riches or gold but of honor, love, and a promise carried forward. And as night fell, Naomi whispered into the quiet air, "I'm not just your granddaughter. I'm your voice now." Summer arrived with warmth that filled the air with the sound of children playing outside, sprinklers spraying across lawns, and the ice cream truck jingling down the block. The oak tree outside Naomi's window was thick with green leaves now, its branches spreading wide like protective arms. Naomi sat beneath it often, her notebooks spread across her lap, her fountain pen moving slowly, deliberately. Her life had begun to change in ways Deborah could hardly keep up with. Letters continued to arrive from schools, teachers, and organizations, praising Naomi's skill and asking her to participate in programs. Ms. Reyes recommended her for a youth cultural exchange trip the following year. The library invited her to help run bilingual story hour for younger children. Deborah often looked at her daughter with both pride and amazement. She was still a little girl who loved hot cocoa at night, but she was also stepping into something much larger than herself. One afternoon, as Naomi sat in the library reading to a group of children, a reporter approached Deborah quietly. "Mrs. Carter? I'm writing an article on the symposium," she explained. "Would you mind sharing Naomi's story? How she learned Japanese, who inspired her?" Deborah hesitated, unsure if she wanted the world knowing their past. But when she looked at her daughter, reading calmly, her voice clear and kind, she nodded. "Yes, I'll share." The article was published a week later, From Maid's Daughter to State Champion, a 12-year-old's journey of honor. It told Naomi's story carefully without sensationalism, but with a respect that touched everyone who read it. Soon, letters began arriving at their apartment. Encouragement from strangers, praise from teachers across the country, even invitations from cultural centers asking Naomi to speak. Deborah read each one aloud at the kitchen table. Naomi listened quietly, smiling shyly, then tucked the letters into a shoebox she labeled Voices. Across the city, the Whitmores raged at the headlines. Charles's trial date was set, his lawyers fighting desperately to delay the inevitable. Victoria's name was dragged through society pages, her once untouchable image now linked with scandal. Brandon's online tantrums resurfaced again and again, each one feeding public ridicule. The world no longer bowed to them. Kenji, however, carried himself as steadily as ever. One evening he invited Naomi and Deborah to join him at a cultural gala downtown. The hall was filled with diplomats, business leaders and scholars, all dressed in elegant attire. Deborah felt nervous at first, her simple black dress modest compared to the glittering gowns around her. But Kenji greeted her with a respectful bow, easing her fears. "Dignity," he said quietly, "is not measured by fabric." Naomi was introduced to professors from universities, artists, and even a Japanese ambassador. Each one shook her hand with genuine admiration. One elderly scholar placed his hand gently on her shoulder. "You remind me of my granddaughter," he said warmly. "But also of something more, an old story that still lives." Naomi bowed politely, her cheeks flushed. Later that night, Kenji spoke briefly at the podium. His words were short but powerful. "Bridges are not built of stone alone. They are built of words carried across generations. Tonight we honor one such bridge." He gestured toward Naomi, who sat wide-eyed at the recognition. Applause filled the hall, Deborah's hands trembling as she clapped, tears spilling down her cheeks. Afterward, as they drove home, Naomi whispered, "Mama, I don't think I'm just reading anymore. I think I'm part of the story now." Deborah held her hand tightly. "Yes, sweetheart. You are." At home, Naomi opened her folktale book again and added a new letter inside. "Grandpa, tonight I was part of something bigger than I can explain. They clapped for me, but I know they were clapping for you too. For the boy with the sad eyes, for the chocolate bar, for the promise you made. I'll keep walking even when the road feels heavy." She closed the book carefully, setting it beside her medal and framed photograph. The green chair by the window held her small form as she drifted into sleep, the oak tree outside rustling softly as though whispering back, "Keep walking." By late summer, Naomi's name was beginning to travel farther than her own neighborhood. Schools across the city invited her to speak, and community centers requested her presence at cultural events. Each time she stood up, her voice carried calm strength beyond her years. Deborah often sat quietly in the audience, her heart swelling as she listened to her daughter speak, not with arrogance but with humility, always acknowledging her grandfather's lessons and Kenji's guidance. But with recognition came challenges. Not everyone clapped. A few sneered, whispering that she was just a child getting attention because of sympathy, not skill. One parent at school muttered loudly enough for Deborah to hear, "How much money is behind that girl? Nobody gets this far without it." Deborah clenched her fists, but Naomi simply straightened her shoulders and walked on. Later that night she told her mother softly, "They don't know. And I don't need to explain." Kenji continued to check in regularly, sometimes by phone, sometimes in person. He never overwhelmed them with gifts or pressure. Instead, he offered structure, reminding Naomi always to move slowly, carefully, with honor. "A bridge can collapse," he told her one evening as they shared tea. "Not from weight but from neglect. Do not neglect your studies. Do not neglect your joy." Naomi nodded, taking the words to heart. Meanwhile, Charles Whitmore's trial drew closer, the city watching closely. News channels replayed clips of him storming out of meetings, headlines declaring the fall of his empire. Once, the Whitmores had seemed untouchable. Now they were reduced to symbols of arrogance and greed. Deborah couldn't help but remember the way Charles had shouted in that penthouse, his threats echoing through the room. That night had ended his empire, though he hadn't known it then. It had been Naomi, her steady voice, her refusal to bow, that had cracked the walls of his power. In contrast, Deborah's own life grew steadier. Her work at the library expanded into a full-time role. She was trusted with organizing programs, leading reading hours, even coordinating with schools. The framed photograph of Walter Carter and Haruto Nakamura stood proudly in the room of honor, where visitors often paused to read the story. Deborah sometimes stood nearby watching children point at the picture, their parents explaining in hushed voices about a war, a friendship, and a promise kept. Naomi continued to write letters. Each one began with, "Grandpa," and ended with, "Your bridge." She tucked them into her folktale book, its spine now thick with folded pages. In one letter she wrote, "Grandpa, I'm starting to understand what it means to carry honor. It's not about medals or applause. It's about standing even when people laugh, speaking even when they don't listen. I think you knew that. I think that's why you gave the chocolate away." One Saturday afternoon, Kenji invited them to a small garden outside the city. The place was quiet, filled with trimmed hedges, koi ponds, and winding stone paths. Naomi walked slowly along the path, her pen and notebook in hand. Kenji encouraged her to sit by the pond. "Right here," he said softly. "Let the water remind you to flow." Naomi dipped her pen, writing steadily. She wrote in both English and Japanese, her strokes careful, her face calm. Deborah watched her daughter from a distance, her heart caught between pride and awe. Kenji stood nearby, hands folded behind his back, his eyes soft. Afterward, they shared tea in a wooden pavilion. Naomi handed her notebook to Kenji, who read her words slowly. He nodded once, then closed the book gently. "Good," he said. "You're learning not only language but patience." Deborah smiled quietly, her eyes glistening. As evening fell, the garden lights flickered on, casting warm glows over the stones. Naomi slipped her notebook back into her backpack, her metal glinting faintly in the fading light. She looked up at Kenji and whispered, "I'll carry it forward." He placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "Yes, that is all you must do." The drive home was silent but full, as if each of them carried unspoken gratitude. When they reached their apartment, Naomi stood at the window, gazing at the oak tree swaying gently in the summer breeze. She whispered softly, "Grandpa, the bridge is holding. It's strong." And with that, she turned out the light, leaving the glow of the moon to keep watch over their home, steady and unwavering. Autumn returned, cool winds sweeping through the city, scattering leaves across sidewalks and playgrounds. The oak tree outside Naomi's window turned golden again, its branches heavy with the weight of another year. Naomi was no longer the quiet girl who once hid behind her backpack. She stood taller now, her voice stronger, her eyes steady. Yet, at her core, she remained humble, still the girl who carried a worn folktale book and wrote letters to a grandfather who had left her his most precious gift, honor. The International Academy in New York sent an invitation that shocked Deborah. Full scholarship consideration, the letter read. "We invite Naomi Carter to apply for early admission based on her exceptional achievements." Deborah sat at the kitchen table, the paper trembling in her hands. "New York?" she whispered. "You're only 12. Naomi tilted her head thoughtfully. "Mama, it's just an invitation. I don't have to decide now. But it means they see me." Kenji called that evening. "The academy is reputable," he said calmly. "But do not rush. Bridges must be walked step by step, not leapt across. She has time." His advice soothed Deborah, who feared her daughter might be carried away too quickly by a world eager to claim her. Meanwhile, the Whitmore trial began. Cameras swarmed the courthouse, reporters crowding the steps. Charles arrived in a wrinkled suit, his face drawn and pale. Once, he had spoken with the confidence of a king. Now his words were clipped, his eyes hollow. Witness after witness described deceit, bribery, and lies written into contracts. David Miller, the interpreter, testified with trembling hands, recounting how Charles had pressured him to falsify translations. The courtroom listened and the world watched. Deborah didn't follow every detail of the trial, but she caught glimpses on the evening news. She saw Charles sitting behind the defense table, no longer a towering figure but a broken man. She saw Victoria avoiding cameras, her diamonds sold, her name whispered like a warning. She saw Brandon slouched in the background, his arrogance drained, his presence irrelevant. One night, as she turned off the television, Deborah whispered softly to herself, "It wasn't me who ended them. It was her." My daughter. My Naomi. At school, Naomi continued to thrive. She joined a small poetry group, surprising herself with how much she enjoyed writing her own short verses. They were simple, often only a few lines, but they carried weight. One evening, she read one aloud to her mother. Leaves keep falling down, but the tree does not let go. It stands quietly. Deborah hugged her tightly. That's you, sweetheart. That's exactly you. Kenji, too, encouraged her poetry. Your grandfather loved haiku, he told her during one of their dinners. He believed they carried truth in small spaces. Keep writing. By mid-November, Naomi was invited to perform at a youth cultural night in the city. The auditorium was smaller than the grand hall she had spoken in before, but the audience was warm and eager. Children from many backgrounds shared dances, songs, and stories. When Naomi's turn came, she stepped forward with her folktale book. She read a passage in Japanese, then explained it in English, ending with her own poem. Bridges hold us up. Even when the wind is strong. We walk together. The applause filled the room, not thunderous but heartfelt, the kind of clapping that carried gratitude more than excitement. Deborah's eyes glistened as she watched her daughter bow gracefully. Kenji's steady hands clapped in rhythm, his expression proud yet calm. Afterward, as they walked home under the autumn night sky, Naomi whispered to her mother, "Mama, I don't feel small anymore. I feel like I'm part of something big." Deborah squeezed her hand gently. That's because you are. The oak tree outside their window swayed in the wind, its golden leaves falling slowly to the ground. Inside their apartment, Naomi tucked another letter into her folktale book. Grandpa, today I read again. Today I spoke for us. People listened. And when I looked out at them, I felt like I was carrying you with me, standing tall. She closed the book carefully, her fountain pen resting on top. The metal on her wall glinted faintly in the lamplight, and the framed photograph of Walter Carter and Haruto Nakamura looked down like silent witnesses to the bridge their descendants had kept alive. Winter returned, sharp and heavy, blanketing the city in white. The oak tree outside Naomi's window stood bare again, its branches stretching against the gray sky. Inside their apartment, warmth glowed steady. The green chair by the window held Naomi's folktale book, its spine thick with letters, while the metal on the wall reflected faint golden light. Life had settled into a rhythm that Deborah never thought possible. Bills were paid on time. The library flourished under her care, children filling its room of honor every week. Neighbors greeted her warmly now, not as the maid who disappeared into wealthy houses, but as a woman whose daughter had given voice to something greater. Naomi thrived at school. Her debate team won regional rounds. Her Japanese essays were praised as if written by older students. She tutored classmates patiently, never boasting, always steady. When teachers spoke of her, it was with respect, not surprise. She had become part of the foundation of the school, a quiet force. One evening, Kenji invited them to dinner at a modest restaurant downtown. The snow fell gently outside, muffling the noise of the city. The meal was simple: warm rice, miso soup, and grilled vegetables, but the air was filled with meaning. At the end of dinner, Kenji raised his cup of tea slightly. "To Bridges," he said softly. Deborah lifted her cup, her eyes shining. Naomi smiled and raised hers too. "To Bridges," she echoed. Kenji set his cup down, his gaze turning thoughtful. "Your grandfather gave my family life in war. You gave my company truth and peace. Both are honor. Both will not be forgotten." Naomi's lips trembled, but she held herself steady. "I'll keep carrying it forward," she promised. Kenji nodded once, deeply. "Yes. Forward." In the weeks that followed, Charles Whitmore's trial reached its conclusion. The court found him guilty on multiple counts of fraud and bribery. Headlines declared it the fall of a dynasty. Victoria vanished from public life entirely, her name spoken only in pity. Brandon disappeared from social circles, no longer feared, no longer admired. The empire that had once towered over others now lay in ruins, dismantled by truth. Deborah didn't rejoice. She didn't need to. Justice had already been spoken the night her daughter read aloud in the Whitmore's penthouse. Everything since had only been echoes. One Sunday morning, Deborah and Naomi visited the cemetery again. Snow dusted the rows of white stones, the air sharp and still. They stood before Walter Leonard Carter's grave, Naomi placing a fresh bundle of white chrysanthemums against the headstone. She whispered softly, "Grandpa, the bridge is strong. It's still holding." Deborah brushed snow from the letters, her breath forming clouds in the cold air. "We're okay now," she whispered. "We're finally okay." Naomi pulled her folktale book from her backpack. She slipped a new letter inside. "Grandpa, I think I understand now. Honor isn't about winning. It's about standing steady even when you're small. It's about speaking when no one expects you to. You gave me that. And I promise I'll never let it go." She closed the book gently, pressing it to her chest. As they walked back toward the car, Naomi looked up at the sky. Snowflakes fell quietly, landing on her braids, melting into tiny drops of water. She smiled, her heart light, her steps steady. That night, sitting in the green chair, Naomi wrote one final note for the year. She wrote it in both English and Japanese, her strokes careful and precise. It was only 3 lines, a haiku she had composed herself. Words carry honor. Bridges across time will stand. Voices never die. She read it aloud softly, her mother listening with tears in her eyes. Then she placed the note into her folktale book, closing it with a gentle thump. The oak tree outside stood silent against the winter sky, its branches bare but strong. Inside, Naomi and Deborah sat together, their small apartment glowing with warmth. And though the world outside was cold, inside was a bridge, built of honor, of words and of love, that would never break.